Imagine, if you will, a time not so long ago, yet infinitely distant in its understanding of the human body. A world shrouded in a veil of ignorance, where the very essence of life, health, and illness was interpreted through lenses of superstition, ancient dogma, and a profound lack of scientific inquiry. We speak, of course, of the Middle Ages, a period often romanticized for its chivalry and grand cathedrals, but one that, when viewed through the harsh light of medical history, reveals practices and beliefs that would make even the most hardened modern physician recoil. It is a world where the line between healing and harm was perilously thin, where prayer was often the most potent prescription, and where a doctor's best tool might have been a good bedside manner rather than actual medical knowledge. Tonight, we peel back this veil. We venture into the dimly lit, often unsanitary, and undeniably terrifying world of medieval medicine. A journey that will undoubtedly leave you profoundly grateful for the scientific advancements of our own era. For while we, in the 21st century, often take for granted the miracles of modern diagnostics, sterile operating rooms, and targeted pharmaceutical interventions, our ancestors faced a reality that was a gamble at best and a gruesome lottery at worst. The shocking truth about medieval medicine is not merely its primitive nature, but the sheer bravery, or perhaps desperation, of those who sought to heal and those who submitted to their ministrations. Our exploration begins not with a sterile operating theater, but perhaps with a village healer or a monk in a scriptorium, painstakingly copying ancient texts. The foundations of medieval medicine were not laid in rigorous scientific study, but rather cobbled together from a fragmented legacy of classical antiquity, heavily influenced by religious doctrine, and liberally seasoned with folk remedies and astrological charts. The grand medical schools that would later emerge in Salerno, Bologna, and Montpellier were still nascent or non-existent in the early centuries of this period, meaning that much of the practical knowledge was passed down orally or contained within scattered, often contradictory manuscripts. There was no widespread, standardized medical curriculum, no universal understanding of anatomy or physiology, and certainly no concept of germ theory. The very idea of microscopic pathogens was centuries away, a concept utterly alien to a world grappling with visible scourges like leprosy and the omnipresent threat of the plague. Consider the prevailing theory of the time, the theory of the four humors. This ancient Greek concept, primarily attributed to Hippocrates and later expanded upon by Galen, formed the bedrock of all medical diagnosis and treatment for over 1,000 years. It posited that the human body was composed of four fundamental fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these humors was associated with a specific element, a season, an organ, and even a temperament. Blood, linked to air and spring, was thought to make one sanguine, cheerful, and optimistic. Phlegm, tied to water and winter, made one phlegmatic, calm, and sluggish. Yellow bile, associated with fire and summer, resulted in a choleric temperament, irritable and hot-tempered. Finally, black bile, connected to earth and autumn, produced a melancholic disposition, gloomy and depressed. Health, according to this theory, was a state of perfect balance among these four humors. Illness, therefore, was a result of an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more humors. If you had a fever, it might be due to an excess of blood or yellow bile. If you were feeling lethargic, perhaps too much phlegm. The goal of the medieval physician, then, was not to fight a specific disease as we understand it today, but to restore this delicate humoral balance. And how did they propose to achieve this? Primarily through methods designed to either remove excess humors or to introduce opposing ones. This led to practices that, from our modern vantage point, seem not only ineffective but often actively harmful. The most iconic, and perhaps most infamous of these practices was bloodletting. If you had too much blood, a common diagnosis for almost any ailment from fever to headache, the solution was simple: remove some of it. This could be done through various means: venesection, where a vein was cut; scarification, where small cuts were made on the skin, or perhaps most memorably by applying leeches. Imagine the scene: a patient already weakened by illness, having their blood drained, sometimes in significant quantities, in the belief that this purging would restore health. It was a common sight, practiced by physicians, barber surgeons, and even sometimes by lay practitioners. The irony, of course, is that for many conditions, blood loss would only further weaken the patient, making them more susceptible to infection and hindering their natural recovery process. Yet the practice persisted for centuries, a testament to the powerful grip of established medical theory, regardless of its demonstrable efficacy. Alongside bloodletting, other purgative measures were common. Cupping, for instance, involved heating a glass cup to create a vacuum, then placing it on the skin to draw blood to the surface, either to collect it, wet cupping, or simply to draw out bad humors, dry cupping. Emetics were administered to induce vomiting, purging the body of perceived excesses. Laxatives and enemas were used to cleanse the bowels, again, with the aim of expelling noxious substances or rebalancing humors. The medieval body was viewed as a system that needed constant purging and rebalancing, rather than one with inherent self-healing capabilities that could be supported by targeted interventions. This humoral theory wasn't just a quaint academic exercise. It permeated every aspect of medieval life and healthcare. Diet was crucial, as certain foods were believed to increase or decrease specific humors. A physician might prescribe a diet rich in cold or hot foods, or wet or dry ones, to counteract an imbalance. The very climate of a patient's home, their usual diet, and even their astrological chart were considered vital information for a proper diagnosis. The heavens, it was believed, influenced each person by affecting elements connected to certain humors, making a knowledge of planetary positions crucial for determining when to treat a patient and when to refrain. A so-called zodiac chart often dictated the optimal times for bloodletting, believing the moon and planets played a direct role in bodily fluids. It was a world where observation was key, but interpretation was flawed. Physicians would examine a patient's urine. Its color, clarity, and even its taste were used as diagnostic tools. They would feel the pulse, palpate the body, and listen to the patient's complaints, all within the framework of humoral theory. The urine flask, in fact, became a symbol of the medieval physician, much like the stethoscope is today. Yet, despite these detailed observations, the underlying causes of disease remained elusive, shrouded in mystery and superstition. They could see the symptoms, but rarely understood the true pathology. The absence of germ theory meant that hygiene, as we understand it, was largely non-existent in medical practice. Surgical instruments were rarely sterilized. Wounds were often dressed with materials that could introduce further infection. The very hands of the healers, who might move from tending to a wound to assisting in childbirth without washing, were unwitting vectors of disease. It is a stark contrast to our meticulous modern protocols, born from centuries of hard-won scientific understanding. This fundamental misunderstanding of disease processes meant that many medical interventions, while well-intentioned, were at best ineffective, and at worst, lethal. The patient's own resilience, their immune system, and perhaps a healthy dose of good luck were often the true healers in an age where medical practice was more art than science, more philosophy than empirical evidence. It is a sobering thought, one that underscores the immense privilege of living in an age where the shocking truth about medicine is how far we've come. If the learned physician, with his urine flask and astrological charts, represented the theoretical, often cerebral side of medieval medicine, then the barber surgeon embodied its brutal, practical reality. Forget the gleaming, sterile operating theaters of today, complete with their dazzling lights and array of specialized instruments. Imagine instead a dimly lit, perhaps blood-splattered corner of a shop, where the scent of unwashed bodies mingled with the acrid tang of cauterized flesh. This was the domain of the barber surgeon, a figure simultaneously essential and terrifying, whose skills ranged from a simple shave to a life-or-death amputation. The very title, barber surgeon, reveals their dual role. For much of the Middle Ages, and indeed well into the early modern period, the practice of surgery was considered a manual trade, far beneath the dignity of the university-trained physician. Physicians dealt with internal ailments, treating the humors, diagnosing from a distance. Surgeons, on the other hand, dealt with the messy, physical aspects of the body: cuts, breaks, external tumors, and the grim necessity of amputation. Because of this division, the task of performing these procedures often fell to those already adept with sharp instruments, the barbers. They had the razors, the steady hands, and the ready supply of hot water and bandages for basic hygiene, even if the concept of germ theory was unknown. Their training was largely apprenticeship-based, passed down from master to apprentice, often through observation and imitation rather than formal education. There were no anatomy classes beyond perhaps witnessing a public dissection, which were rare and often performed on criminals. This meant their understanding of the internal workings of the body was rudimentary at best, and often based on the flawed anatomical diagrams inherited from ancient texts, or simply on what they encountered during their practical, often horrific, work. A good barber surgeon might be skilled at setting a broken bone or lancing a boil, but a deeper understanding of muscle, nerve, or organ function was simply beyond their grasp. One of the most common and certainly most traumatic procedures performed by the barber surgeon was amputation. Imagine a limb crushed in battle or gangrenous from infection, swelling and turning black. In a world without antibiotics, an infected limb was a death sentence. The only hope, a desperate last resort, was to remove it. There was no effective anesthesia beyond perhaps a swig of strong alcohol, a blow to the head to render the patient unconscious, or the administration of opium if available and affordable. The pain, therefore, was excruciating, unimaginable. The patient would have to be held down by several strong assistants, their screams echoing in the room. The surgeon's tools were simple: saws, knives, and hot irons for cauterization. The saw would be used to cut through bone, the knife to sever flesh and muscle. The process was agonizingly slow, precise knowledge of where nerves and arteries lay was limited, and the goal was speed, to minimize the patient's suffering and blood loss. Once the limb was severed, the raw stump had to be dealt with. Blood loss was a major killer. Here, the hot iron came into play. Cauterization, the burning of the stump to seal blood vessels and prevent infection, was a common, brutal technique. The smell of burning flesh would have filled the air, a grim testament to the desperate measures taken to preserve life. And even if the patient survived the immediate trauma, infection was an almost certainty. Without sterile instruments or understanding of bacteria, the open wound was an invitation for a host of deadly pathogens. Many who survived the amputation died days later from fever, sepsis, or gangrene. Beyond amputations, barber surgeons also dealt with a range of other external ailments. Wound care, or what passed for it, was a frequent task. A deep cut from a sword, an arrow wound, or a simple laceration could quickly turn fatal due to infection. Wounds were often cleaned, if at all, with water that was far from sterile, or with wine, which had some antiseptic properties due to its alcohol content. Dressings might be made from linen or wool, sometimes even with cobwebs or moss, materials that could easily introduce bacteria. Pus, rather than being seen as a sign of infection, was often considered a positive sign, a laudable pus, indicating that the body was expelling the bad humors. This profound misunderstanding led to catastrophic outcomes. Another common procedure was the setting of broken bones. Without X-rays, diagnosis was purely by palpation and the patient's symptoms. Barber surgeons would attempt to realign broken limbs, often relying on their experience and intuition. Once set, the limb would be immobilized using splints made from wood, leather, or tightly bound cloth. While some bones would heal remarkably well, many would heal improperly, leading to lifelong deformities, chronic pain, and limited mobility. Complications like bone infections, osteomyelitis, were also common and often untreatable. Trepanation, the drilling of a hole into the skull, was another procedure, surprisingly, with a long history stretching back to ancient times. In the Middle Ages, it was performed for a variety of reasons: to relieve pressure from a head injury, to treat epilepsy, or even to cure mental illness by releasing evil spirits thought to be trapped in the brain. The tools were crude: drills, chisels, and saws. The procedure was incredibly dangerous, with high rates of infection, hemorrhage, and death. Yet, archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals did survive trepanation, indicating a rudimentary understanding of the skull structure, even if the underlying rationale was often based on superstition. The distinction between the highly educated physician and the practical barber surgeon began to blur somewhat later in the Middle Ages, and certainly into the Renaissance. As universities started to incorporate anatomical studies, and as a more empirical approach to understanding the body slowly gained traction, the status of surgery began to rise. However, for centuries, the barber surgeon remained the unsung, often reviled but ultimately necessary, backbone of practical medieval health care. They were the ones who faced the raw, visceral realities of human suffering head-on, armed with little more than sharp tools, strong hands, and a desperate hope for a good outcome. Their patients, equally desperate, put their lives in the hands of these individuals, accepting pain, disfigurement, and often death as the price of a chance at survival. The fact that any survived at all is a testament to the resilience of the human body, not the efficacy of medieval surgical practices. In an age before germ theory, before diagnostics, and before effective pharmacology, when the human body seemed an unpredictable vessel susceptible to unseen forces, it was perhaps inevitable that the spiritual realm would play a dominant role in understanding and combating illness. For the medieval mind, sickness was not merely a physical affliction. It was often viewed through the lens of sin, divine punishment, demonic influence, or the malevolent workings of magic. This profound intertwining of faith and healing meant that prayer, pilgrimages, and even bizarre superstitious remedies were not mere adjuncts to medicine, but often its very core. The Christian Church, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, wielded immense power and influence over every aspect of medieval life, and health was no exception. Illness was frequently interpreted as a test of faith, a punishment for sins committed, or an opportunity for spiritual redemption. Confession and penance were therefore seen as crucial steps towards recovery, believed to appease divine wrath and pave the way for healing. Priests and monks were often the first point of contact for the sick, offering spiritual solace, administering last rites, and often providing what limited medical care was available within monastic infirmaries. These monastic orders often had the best libraries, preserving ancient medical texts and cultivating medicinal herb gardens. Their care, however, was still largely within the humoral framework or based on empirical, unscientific observation. Prayer was, without doubt, the most universally accessible and widely practiced form of medieval medicine. Families would pray incessantly for their ailing loved ones. Communities would gather in churches for collective supplication. Specific saints were invoked for particular ailments: Saint Roch for plague, Saint Apollonia for toothache, Saint Sebastian for infectious diseases, and countless others. Vows were made, promises of offerings or pilgrimages were pledged, all in the desperate hope of miraculous intervention. The fervent belief that God, or his saints, could directly intervene to cure disease offered a profound sense of hope and agency in a world where human medical capabilities were so limited. This belief in divine intervention naturally led to the proliferation of pilgrimages. Journeys to holy sites, particularly those associated with healing miracles or the relics of saints, were undertaken by countless individuals in search of a cure. Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, and Rome were major destinations, but smaller, local shrines also drew streams of the sick and desperate. Imagine the arduous journey. A sick person, perhaps on a litter or barely able to walk, enduring weeks or months of travel, exposure to the elements, and the risk of further illness, all for the chance to touch a sacred relic, drink from a holy well, or simply be present in a place imbued with divine power. Testimonies of miraculous cures abounded, often serving to reinforce the belief system and encourage others to undertake similar journeys. While many undoubtedly found spiritual comfort, genuine physical recovery often remained elusive, a testament to the power of belief, rather than direct divine medical intervention. Relics themselves were considered potent sources of healing. Fragments of bone from saints, pieces of their clothing, or even objects they had touched were revered. These relics were often paraded through towns during epidemics, touched by the sick, or even placed in water to create holy remedies. The more venerated the saint, the more powerful their relics were perceived to be. This practice, while deeply spiritual, also opened the door to widespread fraud and the proliferation of fake relics, as demand far outstripped genuine supply. The Church, for its part, tried to regulate this, but it remained a constant challenge. Beyond the formal religious practices, superstition held an equally powerful, if more chaotic, sway over medieval medical practices. Amulets and charms were commonly worn or carried to ward off illness or evil spirits. These could range from Christian symbols like crosses and medallions to more pagan or folk magic items like specific stones, animal teeth, or written incantations. Sometimes these charms incorporated astrological symbols or Kabbalistic words, blurring the lines between accepted religious practice and what the Church might consider sorcery. The belief was that these objects possessed an inherent protective or healing power, capable of deflecting disease or influencing unseen forces. Folk remedies, passed down through generations, often blended practical herbal knowledge with deeply ingrained superstitious beliefs. While some herbal remedies did possess genuine medicinal properties, an understanding of which was often empirical rather than scientific, Many others were based on sympathetic magic, or simply on tradition. For example, wearing a specific type of stone to cure kidney stones, or burying a sick person's hair under a tree to transfer the illness. The common practice of wearing specific colors was also believed to influence health. Red, for instance, was thought to reduce fever and inflammation, possibly due to its association with blood. The fear of witchcraft and demonic possession also profoundly impacted medieval healthcare. If an illness defied explanation, particularly one with unusual symptoms or mental health disturbances, it was often attributed to the malevolent influence of a witch or a demon. This led to a grim progression, from spiritual consultation to exorcism, and in the worst cases, to accusations of sorcery and the terrifying interrogations that followed. The accused, often women who practiced folk healing or lived on the fringes of society, faced torture and execution, all stemming from a desperate attempt to explain and combat unexplained illness. The line between medical practitioner and accused witch could be perilously thin, particularly for those who practiced outside the established, albeit limited, medical institutions. In essence, medieval medicine operated within a spiritualized cosmos. The human body was not seen as a purely biological machine, but as a vessel interconnected with the heavens, divine will, and unseen spiritual forces. Healing was therefore a holistic endeavor, addressing not just the physical symptoms, but also the spiritual, and sometimes even the astrological dimensions of the patient. While this approach offered comfort and hope in a world of pervasive suffering, it often overshadowed the nascent empirical observations that might have led to more effective medical interventions. The shocking truth is that for many, the path to recovery lay not in the hands of a skilled surgeon or a knowledgeable physician, but in the fervent prayer, the arduous pilgrimage, or the desperate clasp of a superstitious charm. If the learned physician, with his urine flask and astrological charts, represented the theoretical, often cerebral side of medieval medicine, then the barber surgeon embodied its brutal, practical reality. Forget the gleaming, sterile operating theaters of today, complete with their dazzling lights and array of specialized instruments. Imagine instead a dimly lit, perhaps blood-splattered corner of a shop, where the scent of unwashed bodies mingled with the acrid tang of cauterized flesh. This was the domain of the barber surgeon, a figure simultaneously essential and terrifying, whose skills ranged from a simple shave to a life-or-death amputation. The very title, barber surgeon, reveals their dual role. For much of the Middle Ages, and indeed well into the early modern period, the practice of surgery was considered a manual trade, far beneath the dignity of the university-trained physician. Physicians dealt with internal ailments, treating the humors, diagnosing from a distance. Surgeons, on the other hand, dealt with the messy, physical aspects of the body: cuts, breaks, external tumors, and the grim necessity of amputation. Because of this division, the task of performing these procedures often fell to those already adept with sharp instruments, the barbers. They had the razors, the steady hands, and the ready supply of hot water and bandages for basic hygiene, even if the concept of germ theory was unknown. Their training was largely apprenticeship-based, passed down from master to apprentice, often through observation and imitation rather than formal education. There were no anatomy classes beyond perhaps witnessing a public dissection, which were rare and often performed on criminals. This meant their understanding of the internal workings of the body was rudimentary at best, and often based on the flawed anatomical diagrams inherited from ancient texts, or simply on what they encountered during their practical, often horrific, work. A good barber surgeon might be skilled at setting a broken bone or lancing a boil, but a deeper understanding of muscle, nerve, or organ function was simply beyond their grasp. One of the most common and certainly most traumatic procedures performed by the barber surgeon was amputation. Imagine a limb crushed in battle or gangrenous from infection, swelling and turning black. In a world without antibiotics, an infected limb was a death sentence. The only hope, a desperate last resort, was to remove it. There was no effective anesthesia beyond perhaps a swig of strong alcohol, a blow to the head to render the patient unconscious, or the administration of opium if available and affordable. The pain, therefore, was excruciating, unimaginable. The patient would have to be held down by several strong assistants, their screams echoing in the room. The surgeon's tools were simple: saws, knives, and hot irons for cauterization. The saw would be used to cut through bone, the knife to sever flesh and muscle. The process was agonizingly slow, precise knowledge of where nerves and arteries lay was limited, and the goal was speed, to minimize the patient's suffering and blood loss. Once the limb was severed, the raw stump had to be dealt with. Blood loss was a major killer. Here, the hot iron came into play. Cauterization, the burning of the stump to seal blood vessels and prevent infection, was a common, brutal technique. The smell of burning flesh would have filled the air, a grim testament to the desperate measures taken to preserve life. And even if the patient survived the immediate trauma, infection was an almost certainty. Without sterile instruments or understanding of bacteria, the open wound was an invitation for a host of deadly pathogens. Many who survived the amputation died days later from fever, sepsis, or gangrene. Beyond amputations, barber surgeons also dealt with a range of other external ailments. Wound care, or what passed for it, was a frequent task. A deep cut from a sword, an arrow wound, or a simple laceration could quickly turn fatal due to infection. Wounds were often cleaned, if at all, with water that was far from sterile, or with wine, which had some antiseptic properties due to its alcohol content. Dressings might be made from linen or wool, sometimes even with cobwebs or moss, materials that could easily introduce bacteria. Pus, rather than being seen as a sign of infection, was often considered a positive sign, a laudable pus, indicating that the body was expelling the bad humors. This profound misunderstanding led to catastrophic outcomes. Another common procedure was the setting of broken bones. Without X-rays, diagnosis was purely by palpation and the patient's symptoms. Barber surgeons would attempt to realign broken limbs, often relying on their experience and intuition. Once set, the limb would be immobilized using splints made from wood, leather, or tightly bound cloth. While some bones would heal remarkably well, many would heal improperly, leading to lifelong deformities, chronic pain, and limited mobility. Complications like bone infections, osteomyelitis, were also common and often untreatable. Trepanation, the drilling of a hole into the skull, was another procedure, surprisingly, with a long history stretching back to ancient times. In the Middle Ages, it was performed for a variety of reasons: to relieve pressure from a head injury, to treat epilepsy, or even to cure mental illness by releasing evil spirits thought to be trapped in the brain. The tools were crude: drills, chisels, and saws. The procedure was incredibly dangerous, with high rates of infection, hemorrhage, and death. Yet, archaeological evidence suggests that some individuals did survive trepanation, indicating a rudimentary understanding of the skull's structure, even if the underlying rationale was often based on superstition. The distinction between the highly educated physician and the practical barber surgeon began to blur somewhat later in the Middle Ages. and certainly into the Renaissance. As universities started to incorporate anatomical studies, and as a more empirical approach to understanding the body slowly gained traction, the status of surgery began to rise. However, for centuries, the barber surgeon remained the unsung, often reviled but ultimately necessary, backbone of practical medieval health care. They were the ones who faced the raw, visceral realities of human suffering head-on, armed with little more than sharp tools, strong hands, and a desperate hope for a good outcome. Their patients, equally desperate, put their lives in the hands of these individuals, accepting pain, disfigurement, and often death as the price of a chance at survival. The fact that any survived at all is a testament to the resilience of the human body, not the efficacy of medieval surgical practices. Our journey through medieval medicine would be incomplete, and indeed, far too sanitized, without confronting the grim specter of disease itself. In an era devoid of antibiotics, vaccines, or even a rudimentary understanding of germ theory, infectious diseases were not mere inconveniences. They were an ever-present, terrifying, and often inexplicable force that shaped societies, devastated populations, and instilled a pervasive sense of dread. The air itself seemed to carry an invisible threat, and death, in myriad gruesome forms, was a constant companion. No discussion of medieval disease can avoid the monumental catastrophe that was the Black Death. Arriving in Europe in the mid-14th century, this horrific pandemic, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, wiped out an estimated 30% to 50% of the European population in just a few years, and perhaps even more in some regions. Its impact was so profound that it utterly reshaped the social, economic, and religious landscape of the continent. Imagine the terror: swelling buboes in the armpits, groin, and neck, followed by fever, chills, vomiting, and ultimately, a swift and agonizing death. Sometimes victims would develop black spots on their skin, the origin of the Black Death moniker, and cough up blood, leading to the highly contagious pneumonic form of the plague. The medieval response to the Black Death was a chaotic mixture of desperation, devotion, and gross misunderstanding. Physicians, bound by humoral theory, were utterly powerless. They tried bloodletting, purgatives, and strange concoctions, all to no avail. Some advised fleeing infected areas if one could afford it. Others suggested holding fragrant herbs to the nose, burning aromatic woods, or even bathing in vinegar. People turned to flagellation, publicly whipping themselves in penance, believing the plague was divine punishment for sin. Others plunged into hedonistic abandon, believing their end was nigh regardless. Entire villages were depopulated, fields lay fallow, and the social order fractured. The lasting trauma of the Black Death underscored the profound vulnerability of medieval humanity to the unseen killer. But the plague was not the only grim reaper. Leprosy, a chronic bacterial infection, cast a long and terrifying shadow over the medieval landscape. Unlike the swift brutality of the plague, leprosy inflicted a slow, agonizing disfigurement, leading to nerve damage, skin lesions, and the eventual loss of extremities. More than the physical toll, leprosy carried an immense social stigma. Leper colonies, or leprosaria, were established outside city walls, isolating sufferers from the healthy population. Lepers were often forced to carry bells or clappers to announce their presence, warning others to keep their distance. They were seen as spiritually unclean, touched by God's wrath, and their suffering was believed by some to be a living death, a penance for past sins. While some compassionate care was offered within religious orders, the overwhelming response was one of fear, ostracization, and a profound lack of medical understanding about its transmission. Then there was the sweating sickness, a mysterious and highly fatal epidemic that struck England several times between the late 15th and mid-16th centuries. Its onset was sudden and terrifying. Profuse sweating, chills, headache, and a feeling of dread, often leading to death within hours. Its cause remains debated by modern historians, but for medieval people, it was another inexplicable scourge, highlighting their powerlessness in the face of widespread contagion. Other common diseases, while perhaps less dramatic than the pandemics, contributed to a life expectancy that was shockingly low by modern standards. Dysentery, caused by contaminated food and water, was rampant, leading to severe dehydration and death, particularly among children. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, slowly wasted away its victims, causing chronic coughs, fever, and a lingering decline. Smallpox, with its telltale rashes and high mortality rate, was a constant threat, disfiguring survivors and claiming countless lives, especially among the young. These diseases were endemic, meaning they were always present, simmering beneath the surface, ready to flare up and claim lives at any moment. Childbirth, while not a disease in itself, was an incredibly dangerous event in medieval times, a leading cause of death for both mothers and infants. Without modern surgical interventions for complicated births or an understanding of postpartum infection, both went through a perilous ordeal. Puerperal fever, a bacterial infection often caused by unsanitary conditions during delivery, was a silent killer of new mothers. The practice of midwives, though often rooted in centuries of empirical experience, lacked any concept of asepsis, making childbirth a high-risk gamble. Many children never lived to see their first birthday, falling victim to fevers, malnutrition, or the host of infectious diseases that preyed on their underdeveloped immune systems. The impact of these diseases on the medieval mind was profound. They bred fatalism, a sense of human insignificance in the face of divine power or malevolent forces. The constant threat of illness and death meant that life was precarious, and the afterlife became a central preoccupation. Religious fervor often intensified during epidemics, as people sought divine intervention or prepared their souls for the inevitable. Art and literature of the period often reflected this morbid reality, with vivid depictions of the dance of death and memento mori themes, reminders of mortality. Yet, amidst this pervasive suffering, there was also a remarkable resilience. Communities banded together, offering what limited care they could. Monasteries often provided infirmaries, acting as early hospitals. Some cities implemented rudimentary public health measures, such as quarantines during plague outbreaks or attempts to manage waste, though these were often ineffective given the scale of the problem. People also developed a certain hardiness, a tolerance for discomfort, and a grim acceptance of their vulnerability. The reality of these unseen killers underscores perhaps the most shocking truth about medieval medicine: its inherent limitations. Physicians, bound by outdated theories, could offer little practical help against systemic infections. Surgeons could only address external trauma, and while faith offered comfort and hope, it could not stop the relentless march of bacteria and viruses. The story of medieval disease is a stark reminder of the long, often painful, journey humanity has taken to understand and conquer the microscopic world that so profoundly shaped our past. It makes us truly appreciate the scientific advancements that have transformed our world, turning many of these medieval death sentences into treatable conditions today. In a landscape dominated by individual practitioners, the learned physician, the pragmatic barber surgeon, and the mystical apothecary, one might wonder where the truly sick, the indigent, and the dying found refuge. The concept of a modern hospital, a dedicated medical institution with specialized staff and equipment, was centuries away. Yet the Middle Ages did possess its own forms of institutional care, deeply intertwined with charity, religious devotion, and a nascent, often haphazard, understanding of communal well-being. These were the monastic infirmaries, hospices, and almshouses, the humble cradles of care in a harsh world. The most significant early centers for organized care were the monasteries. From their very inception, monastic orders often included provisions for the sick within their communities. Every major monastery typically had an infirmary, a dedicated building or section where ailing monks and, increasingly, sick outsiders could receive care. These infirmaries were often surprisingly well equipped for their time. Monks cultivated extensive herb gardens, herbaria, where they grew a wide variety of medicinal plants. They copied and preserved ancient medical texts, particularly those from classical Greek and Roman sources like Hippocrates and Galen, and later, the influential Arabic medical scholars. This meant that the limited medical knowledge of the age was often concentrated within monastic walls. The care provided in monastic infirmaries was a blend of the spiritual and the practical. Ailing patients would receive prayers and spiritual counsel, but also basic nursing care. Monks often possessed practical skills in wound dressing, simple bandaging, and the administration of herbal remedies. They were meticulous about cleanliness within their confines, though their understanding of hygiene was still limited by the absence of germ theory. The infirmary, the monk specifically appointed to oversee the infirmary, was a respected figure within the monastery, combining spiritual duties with the practicalities of patient care. For many, entering a monastic infirmary was a far better prospect than simply languishing at home, particularly for those without family support. Beyond the monastic walls, the concept of hospices and hospitals began to emerge, driven largely by Christian charity. These institutions were fundamentally different from modern hospitals. They were not primarily focused on medical treatment in the scientific sense, but rather on providing shelter, food, and basic care for the poor, the elderly, the orphaned, and the infirm. The term hospital itself derives from the Latin hosps, meaning guest, reflecting their original purpose as places of hospitality for travelers, pilgrims, and the destitute sick. These early hospitals were typically founded and managed by religious orders, often supported by wealthy patrons or municipal funds. The care provided was primarily nursing care, providing warmth, food, rest, and comfort. While some might have had a resident physician or barber surgeon for more serious cases, the day-to-day care was administered by nuns, monks, or lay brothers and sisters dedicated to charitable works. For diseases like leprosy, specialized leprosaria, leper houses, were established outside city limits, acting as both isolation centers and places of care, often run by dedicated monastic orders like the Order of St. Lazarus. The conditions within these medieval hospitals varied widely. Some were undoubtedly cramped and unsanitary, particularly during outbreaks of infectious disease. Beds were often shared and overcrowding was common. However, some larger, well-funded institutions, such as the Hôtel Dieu in Paris or St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, both founded in the 12th century, attempted to provide more structured care. They might have separate wards for men and women, kitchens for preparing nourishing food, and even rudimentary sanitation systems. Their primary mission, however, remained rooted in Christian charity, providing a dignified place for the sick and dying to find comfort and spiritual solace, rather than a place for advanced medical intervention. Mental illness, often shrouded in even greater mystery and fear than physical ailments, presented a particular challenge for medieval society. The understanding of conditions like depression, psychosis, or anxiety was almost non-existent. Mental illness was frequently attributed to demonic possession, divine punishment, or the influence of malevolent spirits. This belief system led to a range of treatments that were often more harmful than helpful. Exorcism, prayer, and pilgrimages to holy sites believed to have a special power over madness were common. Restraint, often through chains or confinement, was also a grim reality for those deemed a danger to themselves or others. Some larger hospitals and monasteries might have had specific sections for the insane, though these were more custodial than therapeutic. The infamous Bethlem Royal Hospital in London, known colloquially as Bedlam, began as a priory in the 13th century, and by the 14th century was dedicated to treating the mentally ill. However, treatment often involved harsh discipline, cold baths, and sometimes even physical abuse, based on the belief that such methods could shock the patient back to sanity or drive out the demonic influence. While some compassionate individuals might have sought to alleviate suffering, the overall approach to mental illness was characterized by fear, misunderstanding, and often brutality. Despite their limitations, these medieval institutions played a vital role in providing a safety net for the most vulnerable members of society. They were expressions of communal responsibility and deeply held religious convictions. They were places where, even if a cure was impossible, comfort, spiritual guidance, and basic human dignity could be afforded to those facing overwhelming suffering. They represent the nascent stirrings of institutional healthcare, a testament to humanity's enduring impulse to care for its sick and infirm, even when the scientific tools to truly heal were still centuries in the future. The evolution from these charitable hospices to the modern, scientifically driven hospitals of today is one of the most profound transformations in the history of medicine. A quiet revolution that truly makes us glad to live in the now. Having explored the formal structures of medieval medicine, the physicians, surgeons, apothecaries, and hospices, it is crucial to turn our attention to the less glamorous, yet equally impactful, aspects of daily life that profoundly influenced health and disease. For the average medieval person, their direct interaction with a physician might have been rare. Instead, their well-being was far more shaped by what they ate, how they lived, and the sanitary conditions, or lack thereof, of their homes and communities. This brings us to the fascinating, and often rather pungent, topic of medieval diet, hygiene, and public health. Let's first address the common misconception of the entirely unwashed medieval person. While modern standards of hygiene were utterly alien, it is not entirely accurate to imagine a universally filthy population. Bathing, though perhaps less frequent and certainly less private than today, did occur. Public bathhouses, inherited from Roman traditions, existed in some larger towns and cities, albeit their popularity waxed and waned, and their cleanliness was often questionable. In rural areas, people would have washed in rivers, streams, or with water heated over a fire. Soap, often made from animal fat and plant ash, was known, though its use was probably more for laundry than for frequent personal washing. Hands would have been washed before meals, as was customary, though the concept of washing to remove germs was, of course, unknown. However, the reality of personal cleanliness was starkly different from ours. Clothes were not washed frequently, especially outer garments. Undergarments, often made of linen, would be changed more regularly if one could afford it. Hair was often braided or covered to keep it out of the way, and head lice were an almost universal nuisance. Dental hygiene was rudimentary at best. While some might chew on abrasive herbs or use cloths to clean their teeth, tooth decay and gum disease were rampant, leading to chronic pain and tooth loss. The lingering smell of unwashed bodies, stale clothes, and open latrines would have been the pervasive backdrop to medieval life. More critically, it was the state of public hygiene and sanitation that presented the most profound health challenges. Medieval towns and cities, particularly after the population boom in the High Middle Ages, were often incredibly crowded and dirty. Waste disposal was primitive in the extreme. Human and animal waste often accumulated in streets or was simply dumped into rivers that also served as sources of drinking water. Cesspits were common, but these could overflow or leak, contaminating groundwater. Animals, from pigs to chickens, often roamed freely, contributing to the general filth. The concept of sewage systems, as we understand them, was largely non-existent outside of a few Roman-era vestiges. This lack of effective sanitation was a primary driver of disease. Contaminated water supplies led to widespread outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and other waterborne diseases. The presence of rats drawn by the refuse meant that diseases like the plague could spread rapidly once introduced. The air itself, filled with the stench of decaying matter, was believed by some to carry miasmas, noxious fumes thought to cause disease. While the miasma theory was incorrect in its understanding of the mechanism, it did, perhaps inadvertently, encourage some attempts at air purification through burning fragrant herbs or creating bonfires, which might have had a marginal effect on insects. Ventilation in homes was also often poor. Houses, particularly those of the common folk, were small, dark, and smoky, as fires burned indoors for heat and cooking. This led to chronic respiratory problems. The close proximity of people and animals within homes and communities also facilitated the rapid spread of airborne diseases like tuberculosis and influenza. Let's now turn to diet and nutrition, which, while seemingly separate from medical treatments, profoundly impacted overall health and resilience to disease. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants, their diet was monotonous and heavily reliant on staple grains. Bread was the staff of life, consumed in enormous quantities. Porridge and pottage, a thick vegetable and grain stew, were also common. Meat was a luxury, eaten infrequently, usually from hunted game or occasional livestock slaughter or on feast days. Fish, especially salted or dried, was more common, particularly on days of abstinence prescribed by the church. Vegetables were seasonal and varied, but root vegetables, cabbages, and onions were staples. Fruits were also seasonal and consumed fresh. Dairy products like cheese and milk, often soured, supplemented the diet. While this diet was generally sufficient in calories, it was often lacking in diversity and essential micronutrients, especially during the lean months of winter or during periods of famine. Malnutrition, particularly deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, led to weakened immune systems, making people more susceptible to infectious diseases. Children were especially vulnerable. Food preservation methods were crude. Salting, drying, smoking, and pickling were common. These methods, while effective, could sometimes alter the nutritional content of food. Moreover, food spoilage was a constant problem. Without refrigeration, food could quickly become contaminated, leading to food poisoning and further illness. The quality of drinking water, as mentioned, was often poor, leading to chronic digestive issues. Feasts, celebrated by both rich and poor, offered a temporary respite from the monotony of daily diets. For the wealthy, these were lavish affairs with multiple courses of roasted meats, fine breads, cheeses, and spiced wines. While they might have suffered from the diseases of excess, gout, for instance, their access to a wider variety of foodstuffs generally meant they were better nourished and potentially more resilient than their poorer counterparts. The lack of understanding about the importance of a balanced diet, coupled with unpredictable harvests and rudimentary food preservation, meant that scarcity and famine were ever-present threats. When crops failed, or when war disrupted trade routes, the consequences were devastating. Widespread starvation weakened populations, making them easy prey for epidemics. The cyclical nature of scarcity, illness, and death created a relentless struggle for survival for the medieval commoner. In essence, while the grand pronouncements of physicians and the gruesome work of surgeons might capture our imagination, the quiet, daily realities of medieval life, the quality of the water, the cleanliness of the streets, and the nutritional content of the diet were far more significant determinants of health and disease for the average person. These were the unsung heroes, or perhaps more accurately, the unsung villains of medieval health. A world where a simple clean drink of water or a nutritionally diverse meal could have averted more suffering than any physician's elaborate concoction. It is a sobering reminder that many of the health challenges our ancestors faced stemmed not from mysterious diseases, but from fundamental deficiencies in sanitation and nutrition that we, in our modern age, largely take for granted. Having navigated the broader landscape of medieval health, from humoral theories to the pervasive threat of disease and the challenges of daily hygiene, we now narrow our focus to the very tangible, and often terrifying, instruments and procedures employed by medieval healers. In an age of rudimentary technology and empirical trial and error, the medical toolkit was starkly limited, often crude, and invariably painful. This scarcity of effective tools meant that innovation was often born of desperation, and outcomes were largely dictated by fate rather than precision. Imagine the surgical instruments of the time. There were no scalpels of modern precision, no retractors to hold open delicate tissues, no specialized clamps to control bleeding, and certainly no microscopic cameras. Instead, the barber-surgeon's kit might consist of a handful of basic, yet brutally effective, tools. Knives of varying sizes and sharpness for cutting flesh. Saws, often woodworking saws repurposed for bone, for amputations. Forceps and pliers for extracting teeth or removing foreign objects. Probes for exploring wounds, often without any idea of the depth or internal damage. And of course, the ever-present hot irons for cauterization, a method as ancient as it was agonizing. These instruments were rarely, if ever, sterilized. The concept of boiling instruments or using antiseptic solutions was centuries away. Blood and tissue from one patient would simply be wiped off before being used on the next, an unwitting vector for a myriad of deadly infections. The very tools meant to heal were, in many cases, instruments of cross-contamination, contributing directly to the high mortality rates associated with any invasive procedure. One of the most common and perhaps most feared interventions was the extraction of teeth. Without modern dentistry, tooth decay, abscesses, and gum disease were rampant, causing excruciating pain. The barber surgeon or local blacksmith might be called upon to perform an extraction using crude pliers or forceps, often without any pain relief beyond brute force. The procedure would have been traumatic, leading to bleeding, infection, and sometimes even jaw fracture. This explains why many medieval skeletons exhibit significant tooth loss from a relatively young age. Beyond the well-known practices like bloodletting and amputation, medieval practitioners attempted a surprising range of other procedures, often driven by the dictates of humoral theory or ancient texts. Cataract removal, for example, was attempted through a procedure known as couching. This involved using a sharp needle to push the clouded lens of the eye to the bottom of the eye, out of the line of sight. While it might have restored some vision, the risk of infection, glaucoma, or permanent damage was incredibly high, and the procedure was rarely truly successful in the long term. Stone removal, particularly for bladder stones, was another agonizing procedure. These stones, caused by poor diet and contaminated water, could cause immense pain and block urinary flow. The procedure, known as lithotomy, involved cutting into the bladder through the perineum to extract the stone. This was incredibly invasive, performed without anesthesia, and carried a high risk of infection, hemorrhage, and damage to surrounding organs, leading to incontinence or death. Survival was more a matter of luck and the patient's constitution than the surgeon's skill. For deep wounds, particularly from weapons, medieval surgeons sometimes attempted to suture them. However, without sterile techniques, the sutures themselves could introduce infection. More often, wounds were simply packed with cloths, herbs, or even spider webs, in the belief that they would promote healing. The development of wound ointments and salves, often made from a combination of animal fats, herbs, and sometimes even lead or mercury compounds, was also common. While some of these might have had mild antiseptic properties, others were entirely ineffective or actively toxic. Bone sitting, as mentioned earlier, was a skill that varied widely. Fractures were common from accidents or warfare. Splints made of wood, bark, or stiffened cloth were used to immobilize the limb, but without X-rays, proper alignment was often a guess. Many individuals lived with permanent deformities or limited use of a limb due to improperly healed fractures. Diagnosis, in the absence of imaging technologies or laboratory tests, relied almost entirely on the physician's senses and their interpretation within the humoral framework. As discussed, uroscopy, the detailed examination of urine for color, smell, clarity, and even taste, was a primary diagnostic tool, giving rise to the image of the physician holding a urine flask. They would also examine stool, observe skin color, feel the pulse, and listen to the patient's verbal descriptions of symptoms. The language used by patients to describe pain or symptoms would be translated into humoral imbalances, leading to a prescribed course of action. The development of medical knowledge was incredibly slow, often stagnant for centuries. While there was some anatomical understanding derived from ancient Greek and Roman texts, and later from Arab scholars, actual human dissection was rare and often prohibited for religious reasons. When dissections did occur, they were often public spectacles, primarily for demonstration rather than in-depth research, and often focused on verifying the findings of Galen rather than making new discoveries. This meant that the understanding of internal organ function and pathology remained largely theoretical and often incorrect. The learning process for medieval medical practitioners, whether physicians or barber surgeons, was fundamentally different from today. Physicians underwent formal, albeit text-based, education at universities, where they studied ancient authorities like Hippocrates and Galen, often through translated Arabic texts. They learned Latin, logic, and philosophy, but practical clinical experience was minimal. Barber surgeons, on the other hand, learned through hands-on apprenticeship, observing and assisting their masters, often performing procedures long before they truly understood the underlying anatomy. This created a profound divide between theory and practice, often to the detriment of the patient. The limited toolkit, the primitive diagnostic methods, and the profound lack of understanding of microbiology meant that medieval medical procedures were often last resorts, fraught with immense risk. The successful outcomes, when they occurred, were often more a testament to the patient's own resilience and good fortune than to the direct efficacy of the intervention. It is a sobering reflection on a time when pain was inevitable, cleanliness was a luxury, and survival often depended on a combination of robust constitution and a whisper of prayer. In our modern age, we often take for granted the incredible advancements in pain management. From over-the-counter painkillers to sophisticated anesthesia and targeted nerve blocks, the alleviation of suffering is a fundamental pillar of contemporary medicine. But cast your mind back to the Middle Ages, and you enter a world where pain was an almost universal companion, an unrelenting ache that permeated daily life, from the minor discomforts to the agonizing throes of illness, injury, and surgical intervention. The shocking truth about medieval medicine is not just its inability to cure, but its profound limitations in offering even basic relief from suffering. Consider the daily grind, hard labor, inadequate nutrition, exposure to the elements, and the constant threat of accidents meant that aches, sprains, and minor injuries were commonplace. A toothache, which we might dismiss with an ibuprofen, could become a torturous, debilitating ordeal leading to sleepless nights and eventual tooth loss. A broken bone, as we discussed, was not merely a fracture but a cascade of unimaginable pain during setting, followed by weeks or months of throbbing agony. For the medieval person, pain was simply a fact of existence, often endured with a stoicism born of necessity rather than choice. When it came to more severe pain, particularly during surgical procedures, the options for anesthesia were woefully primitive and profoundly dangerous. The primary painkillers available were brute force, alcohol, and a handful of potent, often toxic, natural substances. Alcohol, typically strong wine or ale, was perhaps the most accessible and widely used anesthetic. A patient undergoing an amputation might be given a generous quantity to dull their senses, both physically and emotionally. While it could induce a state of stupor, it rarely rendered them truly unconscious or insensitive to the agonizing pain of the blade. Moreover, excessive alcohol consumption could further dehydrate an already weakened patient, and its depressant effects on the central nervous system could be dangerous. Opium, derived from the poppy plant, was known and used, having been introduced to Europe from Arabic medical texts. It was a powerful analgesic and sedative, capable of inducing a deep sleep or stupor. However, its use was imprecise, its dosage unreliable, and its availability often limited to those who could afford exotic imports. An overdose could easily lead to respiratory depression and death. Furthermore, the addictive nature of opium was not understood in the modern sense, meaning that those who received it for chronic pain might unknowingly develop a dependence. Another common, albeit dangerous, preparation was the soporific sponge or sleeping sponge. This involved soaking a sponge in a concoction of various sedatives and narcotics, which might include opium, hemlock, mandrake, henbane, and sometimes even belladonna or cannabis. The sponge would then be dried and, when needed, moistened and held over the patient's nose and mouth. The patient would inhale the fumes, hopefully inducing a state of unconsciousness. The problem, of course, was the wildly unpredictable dosage and the potent toxicity of many of the ingredients. Mandrake, for example, is a highly poisonous plant, and a slight miscalculation could easily lead to death rather than sedation. The line between anesthesia and lethal poisoning was terrifyingly thin. For this reason, many surgeons opted for speed and brute force over the risks of these experimental anesthetics. For less severe pain, herbal remedies were the primary recourse. Willow bark, containing salicylates, the active ingredient in aspirin, was used for headaches and fevers. Chamomile and valerian were employed for their calming and sedative properties. Clove was used for toothaches, its natural anesthetic properties providing some localized relief. However, the strength and consistency of these preparations varied immensely, and their efficacy was limited compared to modern pharmaceuticals. The concept of pain itself was often viewed differently in the medieval world. It was not merely a physiological response to injury or disease, but often had spiritual connotations. Pain could be seen as a form of divine punishment for sin, a test of faith, or an opportunity for spiritual purification and penance. This theological interpretation, while offering some psychological framework for endurance, also meant that actively seeking to eradicate pain might sometimes be seen as resisting God's will. However, this didn't mean people didn't want relief. It simply added another layer of understanding, or perhaps justification, to their suffering. The acceptance of pain was also deeply embedded in the culture of suffering. Life itself was harsh, marked by constant struggle, warfare, and disease. Death was a familiar presence. This pervasive reality cultivated a certain resilience and fatalism. People learned to endure, to suffer in silence, or to articulate their agony through prayer and lamentation. The medieval person's threshold for pain, born of constant exposure and limited alternatives, was undoubtedly far higher than that of their modern counterparts. In a world without precise diagnostic tools, pain itself often served as a critical, albeit agonizing, indicator of illness. The type, location, and intensity of pain would be used by physicians to help identify which humor was out of balance, or which organ was affected. It was a crude, subjective system, but in the absence of any other objective measures, it was often all they had. The contrast between this medieval reality and our modern experience of pain management is truly astonishing. We live in an era where effective pain relief is considered a fundamental human right in medical care. The ability to undergo complex surgery without feeling a thing, to recover from injury without prolonged agony, or to manage chronic conditions with targeted medications, is a testament to centuries of scientific struggle and discovery. The medieval person, often enduring excruciating pain with little more than a strong drink and a prayer, lived a life that was, in this respect, infinitely harsher and more unforgiving than our own. It is a profound reminder of the silent, enduring suffering that characterized much of humanity's past, and a quiet thanksgiving for the medical comforts of the present. In an age before the internet, before mass-produced textbooks, and indeed before the widespread availability of paper, the transmission of knowledge was a slow, arduous, and often incredibly fragile process. For medieval medicine, this meant that understanding the human body and its ailments was largely confined to specific, often isolated, centers of learning, and profoundly shaped by the reverence for ancient texts. The scholarly silos of monasteries and nascent universities, combined with a crucial bridge built by Arabic medicine, formed the complex, sometimes contradictory, pathways through which medical wisdom, or what passed for it, trickled down through the centuries. At the very beginning of the Middle Ages, much of the classical medical knowledge of Greece and Rome, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen, faced the very real threat of being lost to the West. The decline of the Roman Empire and the subsequent societal upheavals meant that literacy rates plummeted, and many invaluable scrolls and codices either decayed, were destroyed, or simply became inaccessible. It was largely within the insulated walls of monasteries that this ancient learning was painstakingly preserved. Monks working in their scriptoria would meticulously copy manuscripts by hand, often without fully understanding the medical content, but driven by a desire to preserve knowledge. These copies, often embellished with illustrations, became the primary repositories of Western medical thought for centuries. However, many of these texts were incomplete, corrupted by errors introduced during copying, or simply represented a limited selection of the broader classical tradition. This meant that what medical wisdom was available was often fragmented and sometimes distorted. The true revitalization of medical knowledge in Europe came not from within, but from without, through the intellectual dynamism of the Islamic Golden Age. While Europe was grappling with the challenges of the early Middle Ages, Islamic scholars from the 8th to the 13th centuries were actively translating, preserving, and most importantly, expanding upon Greek, Roman, and even Indian medical texts. Figures like Rhazes al-Razi, Avicenna ibn Sina, and Averroes ibn Rushd became titans of medicine, whose comprehensive works far surpassed anything available in the Latin West at the time. Avicenna's The Canon of Medicine, Al-Canon fi al-Tib, was particularly monumental. This encyclopedic work systematically compiled the medical knowledge of the ancient world, integrated with Islamic empirical observations and clinical experiences. It covered anatomy, pathology, pharmacology, and clinical practice, and became the authoritative medical textbook for both the Islamic world and, crucially, for Europe, once it was translated into Latin in the 12th century. The influence of Arabic medicine on the Latin West cannot be overstated. It was the primary conduit through which much of the classical heritage, enriched by new insights, flowed back into Europe. With the advent of the university in the High Middle Ages, from the 11th century onwards, medical education began to take on a more formal structure. Early medical schools such as Salerno in southern Italy and later Bologna, Padua, and Montpellier became centers of learning. Here, the curriculum was heavily reliant on the newly translated Greek and Arabic texts. Students would study Galen, Hippocrates, and especially Avicenna. The emphasis was on theoretical knowledge, logic, and philosophy, with little practical clinical experience. A medical degree was a mark of intellectual prestige, but not necessarily a guarantee of effective healing ability. The method of teaching was primarily through lectures and commentaries. A master would read from an authoritative text, and students would copy notes and engage in disputations, debates, on theoretical points. This meant that new ideas or challenges to established dogma were rare. The authority of the ancient masters, particularly Galen, was almost sacrosanct. To challenge Galen was to challenge the very foundation of medical understanding, a risky intellectual endeavor. This reverence for ancient authority, while preserving valuable knowledge, also stifled innovation and empirical observation for centuries. Anatomy, as we discussed earlier, remained a significant blind spot. While Arabic physicians had made some advances in anatomical understanding, and some limited dissections were performed in European universities later in the period, these were rare and often intended to confirm Galen's teachings rather than make new discoveries. Galen's anatomical knowledge, however, was largely based on animal dissection, not human, leading to numerous inaccuracies that persisted for centuries. Imagine studying human anatomy from texts based on the dissection of apes or pigs. The resulting misconceptions were profound. The lack of widespread literacy also presented a major barrier to the dissemination of medical knowledge. Before the printing press, which arrived in the mid-15th century, every medical book had to be laboriously copied by hand, making them incredibly rare, expensive, and prone to errors. This meant that medical knowledge was largely confined to a small elite of educated scholars, leaving the vast majority of the population reliant on folk healers, barber surgeons, and oral tradition. Even after the advent of printing, medical texts remained complex and often in Latin, limiting their accessibility. Furthermore, the integration of astrology into academic medicine meant that physicians spent considerable time studying celestial movements and their supposed influence on bodily humors. This was considered a legitimate scientific pursuit, a reflection of the interconnectedness of the cosmos, rather than a superstition. The precise timing of bloodletting or the administration of a purgative might be determined by the position of the moon or stars, a testament to the blend of science and mysticism that permeated medieval thought. In essence, medieval medical education and knowledge transmission were characterized by a curious blend of preservation and stagnation. The dedicated efforts of monastic scribes, the intellectual bridge provided by Arabic scholars, and the emergence of universities laid important groundwork. However, the reverence for ancient authority, the limited opportunities for practical dissection, and the slow, laborious process of manuscript copying meant that fundamental misconceptions persisted, and genuine medical progress was agonizingly slow. It was a world where knowledge was a precious, often guarded commodity, and where the most advanced medical wisdom of the day was still a pale shadow of what was needed to truly understand and conquer the complexities of human disease. Having explored how medical knowledge was transmitted, or often stifled, in the Middle Ages, we now turn to perhaps the most fundamental aspect of medicine, the understanding of the human body itself. How did medieval physicians and surgeons believe our intricate inner workings functioned? The answer, startlingly to modern ears, is often with profound inaccuracies, born from a lack of direct observation, a staunch adherence to ancient authority, and a pervasive philosophical lens that viewed the body as far more than just biological machinery. The shocking truth about medieval medicine is that even the most learned minds operated with a largely flawed map of the very terrain they sought to heal. At the heart of medieval anatomical and physiological understanding lay the enduring legacy of Galen of Pergamon. A brilliant Roman physician who lived in the 2nd century AD, Galen's voluminous writings dominated Western medical thought for over 1,300 years. His theories, particularly on anatomy, were considered almost infallible. The immense problem, however, was that Galen's anatomical knowledge was largely derived from the dissection of animals, primarily apes, pigs, and other mammals, rather than human cadavers. This was due to Roman societal prohibitions against human dissection. Consequently, many of Galen's descriptions, meticulously detailed as they were for animals, simply did not accurately reflect human anatomy. For example, Galen believed that blood originated in the liver and flowed outwards through the veins, being consumed by the tissues. He posited that the heart had invisible pores through which blood passed from one side to the other, a notion that completely missed the concept of circulation as we understand it today. He also believed that the human jaw was made of two bones, like that of an ape, rather than a single bone. These and countless other errors were faithfully perpetuated in medieval medical texts, copied and recopied, passed down as indisputable truth for centuries. Human dissection in the Middle Ages was exceptionally rare, and when it did occur, it was fraught with challenges. For much of the period, religious and societal taboos often prohibited the desecration of the human body. The soul was paramount, and the body was seen as sacred. When dissections became more accepted, primarily in later medieval universities, from the 13th and 14th centuries onwards, they were often public events, spectacles more than meticulous scientific inquiries. A professor would read from an authoritative text, typically Galen or Avicenna, while a barber surgeon, often with less education, would perform the actual cutting. The purpose was usually to demonstrate what the texts described, rather than to discover new information or correct errors. If what was seen on the cadaver contradicted the text, it was often assumed the cadaver was abnormal, or the observer had misunderstood, rather than that the text itself was flawed. This institutionalized reverence for ancient authority severely hampered genuine anatomical understanding. Physiology, the study of how the body functions, was equally constrained by this reliance on flawed anatomical maps and the pervasive humoral theory. As we discussed, the belief that health was a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile dictated all physiological understanding. Digestion, for example, was believed to be a process akin to cooking, transforming food into humors in the stomach, which were then further refined in the liver. Respiration was thought to cool the heart and produce vital spirit. The nervous system, though recognized as responsible for sensation and movement, was poorly understood in terms of its connection to the brain and spinal cord, and was often tied into the concept of animal spirits flowing through the nerves. The medieval mind also viewed the human body as a microcosm, a small universe reflecting the larger cosmos. Just as the universe was made of four elements: earth, air, fire, water, so too was the human body composed of four humors. The health of the individual was seen as intrinsically linked to the influence of the planets, the seasons, and even the weather. This philosophical approach, while aesthetically pleasing, often overshadowed empirical observation and led to treatments based on astrological charts rather than physiological understanding. A patient's temperament, or complexion, was believed to be determined by the dominant humor, and this would dictate not only their personality, but also their susceptibility to certain diseases and their appropriate treatment. Beyond the formal university settings, the practical knowledge of the barber surgeon, gleaned from centuries of operating on injuries and battlefield trauma, offered a more direct, albeit limited, understanding of the body. They knew where the major arteries lay, the approximate locations of organs, and how bones fractured. This practical, often grim, experience often stood in stark contrast to the theoretical knowledge of the university physician, creating a divide in medieval medical practice. The absence of crucial tools like the microscope meant that the very existence of cells, bacteria, and viruses was completely unknown. Disease was therefore viewed through a macro lens, focusing on visible symptoms and their humoral interpretation, rather than the microscopic pathogens that were often the true culprits. Infection, for instance, was seen as a putrefaction of humors, or a consequence of bad air, miasma, not as the invasion of microorganisms. This fundamental blind spot was perhaps the greatest impediment to effective medical intervention. It was not until the Renaissance, with figures like Andreas Vesalius in the 16th century, that a radical shift in anatomical understanding began to occur. Vesalius, through meticulous human dissection and a courageous willingness to challenge Galen's authority, published De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, a groundbreaking work that corrected hundreds of Galen's errors. This marked a turning point, ushering in an era of empirical observation and direct study of the human body, setting the stage for true physiological understanding. But for the vast majority of the Middle Ages, the inner workings of the human body remained a largely mysterious and misinterpreted landscape. Physicians and surgeons operated with a map full of errors, believing in channels and pores that didn't exist, and failing to comprehend the true mechanisms of circulation, respiration, or digestion. It is a sobering testament to the power of established dogma and the profound challenges of scientific discovery in an age without the tools, the freedom, or the intellectual framework for true empirical inquiry. The medieval body, in the eyes of its healers, was a riddle, imperfectly understood and often tragically mistreated. In the grand narratives of medieval medicine, the figures of the university-trained physician and the formidable barber surgeon often stand in the foreground. Yet, for the vast majority of the population, particularly in rural areas or within the domestic sphere, medical care was far more likely to be delivered by the hands of women. The shocking truth about medieval medicine, often obscured by male-centric historical accounts, is the pervasive and indispensable role of women as healers, even as their formal recognition and legal standing remained precarious, and their own experiences as patients were often fraught with unique dangers. The most prominent and universally recognized female medical practitioners were the midwives. From the dawn of time until well into the modern era, childbirth was almost exclusively the domain of women. Male physicians were rarely, if ever, present during labor and delivery, considered an intimate and unseemly affair for men. Midwives were essential figures in every community, possessing a wealth of practical, empirical knowledge passed down through generations. They assisted in births, offering comfort, guidance, and practical interventions. They knew how to deliver babies in various presentations, how to deal with minor complications, and how to care for both mother and newborn in the immediate postpartum period. Their skills were invaluable, often learned through years of apprenticeship and direct experience. However, the midwife's knowledge, while extensive in practice, was entirely unscientific by modern standards. They had no understanding of aseptic technique, the causes of puerperal fever, or the need for advanced surgical intervention in complicated cases. When a delivery went wrong, due to obstructed labor, hemorrhage, or infection, the outcome was almost invariably tragic for both mother and child. Childbirth remained the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age throughout the Middle Ages. Despite this, the midwife was a respected, vital member of her community, privy to the intimate details of family life, and often acting as a trusted confidant. Beyond midwifery, women also served as village healers or wise women. These were often older women, experienced in the use of local herbs, folk remedies, and traditional healing practices. They might offer advice for common ailments, prepare poultices for wounds, or dispense remedies for digestive issues. Their knowledge was eclectic, a blend of genuine herbal lore, superstitious beliefs, and practical nursing. They often understood the emotional and social dimensions of illness, offering comfort and counsel alongside their physical treatments. For the common folk, these wise women were often the first, and sometimes only, recourse for medical problems, more accessible and affordable than a distant, learned physician. However, the wisdom of these female healers existed in a precarious space. While respected, their practices were often viewed with suspicion by the church and emerging male medical professions. As the Middle Ages progressed, and as medicine began to formalize in universities, there was a concerted effort to professionalize and regulate the healing arts, largely excluding women. Women were barred from attending universities, and thus from becoming licensed physicians or surgeons. This created a tension. The practical, often effective knowledge of female healers was deemed unprofessional or unlearned, even as university-trained men often lacked the hands-on experience of these women. This marginalization, combined with the pervasive fear of the unknown, unfortunately contributed to the dark phenomenon of the witch hunts that would gain terrifying momentum in the late medieval and early modern periods. A village healer whose remedies failed, or who challenged established norms, could easily be accused of witchcraft, her knowledge reinterpreted as malevolent magic. The very skills that made her invaluable could become her undoing, a shocking testament to the dangers faced by women who dared to practice medicine outside official, male-dominated channels. As for women as patients, their experiences were often shaped by both the general limitations of medieval medicine and specific gendered considerations. Conditions unique to women, such as menstrual irregularities, infertility, and gynecological issues, were often poorly understood and subject to various superstitious or humoral interpretations. Treatments could range from herbal concoctions to bizarre rituals or even aggressive interventions based on flawed anatomical assumptions. The concept of wandering womb, an ancient belief that the uterus could move freely within the body causing various ailments, persisted for centuries, leading to a range of ineffective and sometimes harmful cures. Furthermore, women's voices in the medical context might have been less heard or dismissed compared to men's. The societal expectation of female modesty could make it difficult for women to fully describe their symptoms, particularly those related to intimate health, to male physicians. This undoubtedly led to misdiagnosis or inadequate treatment. The relative lack of medical literature focusing specifically on women's health beyond childbirth also speaks volumes about the priorities and blind spots of the male-dominated medical establishment. Despite these challenges, women, through necessity and their inherent roles in the domestic sphere, were also the primary caregivers within families. Mothers, wives, and daughters nursed the sick, prepared remedies, and provided comfort. This informal, yet vital, role as caregivers meant that a vast amount of practical medical knowledge, particularly concerning common ailments and first aid, was held and transmitted by women within the home. In sum, the story of women in medieval medicine is a complex tapestry of indispensable contributions and systemic marginalization. As midwives and wise women, they were the frontline healers for countless communities, their practical skills and compassionate care providing solace and, often, survival. Yet, as the formal medical professions coalesced, their roles were diminished, their knowledge often dismissed, and their very existence sometimes made perilous. For the medieval woman as a patient, her journey through sickness was often marked by a unique blend of vulnerability, limited understanding, and a reliance on a network of female healers whose courage and skill were too often unacknowledged by history. It reminds us that progress in medicine is not just about scientific discovery, but also about the dismantling of social barriers to knowledge and care. While the ravages of disease and the challenges of daily life constituted the most common threats to medieval health. Another formidable force relentlessly shaped medical practice: warfare. The Middle Ages were, by and large, a tumultuous period, punctuated by incessant conflicts, petty skirmishes, sieges, crusades, and civil wars. The battlefield was a grim laboratory where bodies were rent by sword, arrow, and axe, presenting surgeons with a horrifying array of trauma that pushed the limits of their crude knowledge and forced desperate, often unintended, innovations. The shocking truth about medieval medicine is that some of its most practical, albeit painful, advancements emerged from the very crucible of human violence. Imagine the aftermath of a medieval battle: the air thick with the metallic scent of blood, the groans of the wounded, and the cries for mercy. Knights in heavy armor, squires, and foot soldiers lay broken, pierced, and dismembered. For the medical practitioners of the age, often barber surgeons accompanying armies, this was their domain. Unlike the internal ailments that puzzled physicians, battlefield injuries were raw, visceral, and demanded immediate, if brutal, action. The most common injuries were, predictably, lacerations and punctures from swords, daggers, and spears. These wounds, often deep and jagged, were prime candidates for infection. Arrows, especially barbed ones, posed a particular challenge. Extracting them without further damage was a delicate, often futile task. Surgeons developed specific tools, like arrow extractors, which were essentially long, slender forceps, but their use was often limited by the arrow's depth and barb. If an arrow was deeply embedded, it might be left in place, leading to chronic infection and a slow, painful death or amputation if feasible. Fractures and dislocations were also rampant, caused by falls from horses, blunt force trauma from maces, or the crushing weight of heavily armored opponents. As discussed, bone setting was a skill learned through experience. Battlefield surgeons would attempt to manipulate broken limbs back into alignment, often with agonizing force, and then immobilize them with rudimentary splints made from wood, leather, or tightly bound cloth. While some would heal, many would heal poorly, leading to permanent disfigurement and disability, a common sight among veteran soldiers. But it was the increasing prevalence of gunpowder weapons in the later Middle Ages that introduced a new, horrific dimension to battlefield trauma. Early cannons and handguns created wounds that were entirely different from those inflicted by edged weapons. The force of the projectile caused massive tissue destruction, leaving large, ragged, often charred wounds that were highly susceptible to infection. The medieval surgeon had no understanding of shock or the internal damage caused by these projectiles. The treatment for these fire wounds often involved pouring boiling oil into them, based on the erroneous belief that the gun's powder poisoned the flesh. This agonizing practice, believed to prevent gangrene, undoubtedly caused more harm than good, increasing pain, tissue damage, and the risk of fatal infection. It was only later, through the observations of figures like Ambroise Paré in the Renaissance, that this barbaric practice was slowly abandoned in favor of more gentle methods of wound care. Amputation, as we've highlighted, was the ultimate resort for limbs that were shattered beyond repair or consumed by gangrene. On the battlefield, with limited time, resources, and no anesthesia, these procedures were carried out with grim efficiency. Speed was paramount to minimize blood loss and the patient's unbearable agony. The best surgeons were those who could complete the dismemberment most quickly. The immediate survival rate for battlefield amputations was likely very low, given the pervasive infection and shock. Despite the primitive conditions, the constant demands of warfare did, paradoxically, foster a certain empirical learning. Unlike the theoretical focus of university physicians, battlefield surgeons gained invaluable hands-on experience. They saw hundreds, even thousands of wounds, observed what worked, or more often, what didn't, and developed practical skills through sheer repetition. This practical knowledge was often passed down through military medical manuals, which were more direct and pragmatic than the academic texts. These manuals might detail specific ways to extract arrows, set common fractures, or manage basic bleeding. The development of prosthetics, albeit rudimentary, also saw some innovation driven by the needs of disfigured soldiers. Simple wooden pegs, hooks, and basic artificial limbs were fashioned to allow veterans to regain some semblance of functionality. While far from sophisticated, these early prosthetics demonstrated a pragmatic response to the devastating injuries of war. The experience of wounded soldiers also highlighted the crucial need for basic nursing care. Even without advanced medical treatments, rest, warmth, food, and clean dressings could make a significant difference. Religious orders like the Knights Hospitaller, originally founded to care for pilgrims, expanded their mission to care for wounded crusaders, establishing some of the earliest, most organized military hospitals. These institutions, while still limited by the overall medical knowledge of the era, offered a more structured environment for recovery than the chaos of the battlefield. In essence, the medieval battlefield was a harsh teacher. It exposed the limitations of humoral theory in the face of direct trauma and forced practitioners to confront the physical realities of injury head-on. While surgical methods remained crude and painful, and infection was an almost inevitable consequence, the sheer volume of wounds provided an unparalleled, albeit tragic, opportunity for practical learning. The experience of warfare, more than any abstract academic debate, pushed the boundaries of what medieval medicine could attempt, even if the progress was agonizingly slow and purchased at an immeasurable cost in human suffering. But what about the Middle Ages? In an era where medical knowledge was limited, outcomes were uncertain, and the line between healer and charlatan was often blurry. How did society attempt to regulate its practitioners? And what recourse did a patient have if things went tragically wrong? The shocking truth about medieval medicine is that while the seeds of ethical conduct were sown, the reality of malpractice and accountability was a complex, often perilous landscape for both the healer and the healed. It reminds us that behind every grand battle lay countless individual tragedies, and the desperate, often futile, efforts of healers armed with little more than courage and a sharp blade. In our modern world, the practice of medicine is governed by a vast web of laws, ethical codes, and regulatory bodies designed to protect patients and uphold professional standards. The most enduring ethical framework inherited from antiquity was the Hippocratic Oath. While its precise form and widespread adoption in the Middle Ages are debated by historians, its core principles, to do no harm, to maintain patient confidentiality, and to act in the best interest of the sick, certainly influenced medical thought. University-trained physicians, in particular, would have been exposed to these ideals through their study of classical texts. Their status as learned professionals meant they were expected to adhere to a higher standard of conduct than, say, a rural bone setter. They were expected to be sober, discreet, compassionate, and to avoid treating patients if they believed their efforts would be futile. However, the reality of medical practice often diverged sharply from these lofty ideals. Given the profound limitations of medieval medicine, malpractice was an almost inherent risk. A physician's misdiagnosis, a barber surgeon's botched procedure, or an apothecary's wrongly mixed potion could all lead to severe injury, disfigurement, or death. What then was the legal recourse for a grieving family or a permanently disabled patient? Formal legal avenues were often limited. Justice systems were localized, slow, and heavily influenced by social standing. A peasant who felt wronged by a physician might find it nearly impossible to bring a successful charge against a respected, university-educated professional. However, accusations of malpractice were not unheard of, particularly against less formally trained practitioners. A local court might hear a complaint if a death or severe injury could be directly attributed to clear negligence or gross incompetence. For instance, a surgeon performing a procedure far outside their recognized skills, or a healer selling a known poison as a cure. The penalties could range from fines to public shaming, or even expulsion from the community. The emerging medical guilds played a crucial role in self-regulation, particularly for barber surgeons and apothecaries. These guilds, like other craft guilds of the time, sought to control entry into their professions, set standards for training apprenticeships, and protect their members' interests. They would often establish rules regarding fair pricing, the quality of ingredients for apothecaries, and the appropriate scope of practice. Guilds could discipline members for unethical conduct, incompetence, or violating guild rules. This system, while not as robust as modern licensing bodies, represented a significant step towards imposing some order on the chaotic medical landscape. For example, in London, the Fellowship of Surgeons and the Company of Barbers eventually merged, reflecting attempts to control who could perform certain procedures. The patient-healer relationship itself was often complex and highly stratified by social class. A wealthy noble might command the attention of the most learned physician, benefiting from prolonged care and access to expensive remedies. Their status might also afford them the right to demand certain treatments or to challenge a physician's advice. For the common person, however, the relationship was often one of stark necessity and deference. They sought help from whoever was available and affordable, a local healer, a priest, or perhaps a traveling quack. Their ability to question treatment or seek alternatives was severely limited by their economic and social standing. Quackery and charlatanism were rampant. With so much uncertainty surrounding genuine healing, it was easy for unscrupulous individuals to peddle false hopes and miracle cures. Traveling doctors would arrive in towns, selling elixirs or performing theatrical operations, often sleight-of-hand tricks for a quick profit before moving on. These charlatans preyed on the desperation of the sick, offering grandiose promises that no legitimate practitioner could fulfill. While authorities sometimes attempted to crack down on these practices, their pervasive nature reflected the deep-seated yearning for effective cures that legitimate medicine could not provide. The concept of informed consent, so critical today, was entirely absent. Patients had little understanding of the proposed treatments, their risks, or alternative options. Trust was often placed blindly in the healer, or born of sheer desperation. The very idea of patient autonomy, of an individual's right to make decisions about their own medical care, was centuries away. Furthermore, the cost of medical care was a significant ethical consideration. While monastic institutions offered free care to the poor, private practitioners expected payment. For many, this meant that access to even the limited medical care available was a luxury. A family might have to sell off meager possessions or incur significant debt to pay for a physician's visit or an apothecary's concoction. This economic barrier inevitably led to disparities in health outcomes, with the poor often receiving no care beyond basic home remedies or prayer. In conclusion, the ethical and legal landscape of medieval medicine was a nascent, often contradictory domain. While the lofty ideals of the Hippocratic Oath floated in the academic air, the ground-level reality was far messier. The struggle to define standards, regulate practice, and hold healers accountable was an ongoing one, complicated by limited knowledge, widespread quackery, and deep social inequalities. For the patient, entrusting their life to a medieval healer was often an act of profound faith, a gamble against pain, infection, and ignorance, with little certainty of redress if that faith proved tragically misplaced. It is a stark reminder of the long, often painful, journey towards the ethical, regulated, and patient-centered healthcare systems we strive for today. Even as figures like Vesalius challenged ancient anatomical dogma and Paré championed more humane surgical practices, it is crucial to understand that these were mere sparks in a vast, lingering darkness. The transition from medieval to truly modern medicine was not a sudden leap, but an agonizingly slow, fitful crawl spanning centuries. The shocking truth about medieval medicine in its dying embers is how slowly, yet inexorably, the seeds of modern science began to sprout. One of the most significant catalysts for change was the rediscovery of classical texts, often fleeing the fall of Constantinople in 1453. While some Greek and Roman medical works, particularly Galen, had been known through Arabic translations, many others, including a wider array of Hippocratic writings and other important philosophical and scientific works, now became available in their original Greek or in more accurate Latin translations. This access to a broader, purer stream of ancient knowledge encouraged scholars to critically re-examine existing interpretations and, inadvertently, sometimes revealed inconsistencies or errors in the long-venerated authorities. It wasn't an outright rejection of the ancients, but a deeper, more nuanced engagement that occasionally exposed their limitations. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in the mid-15th century was a true revolution for all fields of knowledge, including medicine. Suddenly, books were no longer rare, expensive, hand-copied manuscripts confined to university libraries. They could be produced in greater numbers more cheaply and with fewer copying errors. This meant that medical texts, including translations of Greek and Arabic works, and increasingly new commentaries and observations, could spread more widely. Knowledge, formerly restricted to an elite few, began to disseminate more broadly, fostering a more rapid exchange of ideas and allowing more individuals to engage with complex medical theories. This accessibility, though still limited by literacy, was a crucial step towards the eventual democratization of scientific understanding. Perhaps the most pivotal shift, however, was the burgeoning, albeit cautious, move towards empiricism. The idea that knowledge should be based on observation and experience, rather than solely on inherited authority. This was a slow, difficult break from centuries of tradition. While medieval medicine did involve observation of urine, pulse, symptoms, the interpretation of those observations was always filtered through the lens of humoral theory. The Renaissance, however, saw individuals beginning to challenge this. Anatomical studies became a key battleground for this emerging empiricism. The restrictions on human dissection began to loosen, particularly in Italian universities like Padua and Bologna. While still rare, dissections became more frequent, and crucially, some anatomists began to truly look at the human body, rather than merely using dissection to confirm Galen's teachings. The most iconic figure of this anatomical revolution was Andreas Vesalius, 1415–64. A Flemish anatomist, Vesalius meticulously performed his own human dissections, personally observing and drawing what he saw. In 1543, he published his monumental work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica Libri Septem, on the fabric of the human body in 7 books. This was not merely a new edition of Galen. It was a groundbreaking, lavishly illustrated text that meticulously detailed human anatomy based on direct observation. Vesalius fearlessly corrected hundreds of Galen's errors, from the number of bones in the jaw to the structure of the heart. His work was a direct challenge to the unquestioned authority of the ancients and heralded a new era of anatomical accuracy. It was a shocking revelation for many, proving that direct observation could indeed overturn centuries of established belief. Beyond anatomy, early stirrings of empiricism could be seen in the burgeoning field of surgery. While still a brutal craft, practical experience on battlefields and in the rapidly growing urban centers led some barber surgeons to question traditional methods. Figures like Ambroise Paré, c. 1510–1590, a French barber surgeon, are illustrative of this shift. Initially trained in the traditional method of cauterizing gunshot wounds with boiling oil, Paré famously ran out of oil during a battle. Out of necessity, he simply dressed the wounds with a mixture of egg yolk, rose oil, and turpentine. To his astonishment, the patients treated with this gentler method fared far better than those who had been cauterized. This direct, empirical observation led him to abandon the barbaric practice, marking a significant, albeit gradual, improvement in wound care. Paré also developed better techniques for ligating, tying off blood vessels during amputations, a far safer alternative to cautery. His focus on gentle care and his willingness to observe and adapt were truly revolutionary. The concept of disease classification also began to evolve. While still largely within the humoral framework, some physicians began to observe and describe diseases more systematically, recognizing distinct symptom clusters that went beyond simple humoral imbalances. This was a slow process, but it foreshadowed the later development of clinical medicine and the idea of specific diseases with specific causes. However, it is crucial to remember that this was a period of transition, not immediate transformation. The vast majority of medical practice remained firmly rooted in medieval traditions. Humoral theory continued to dominate, and practices like bloodletting remained popular for centuries to come. The new empirical approaches were often met with skepticism and resistance from the established academic and religious institutions. The change was slow, often occurring in fits and starts, and the overall quality of care for the average person likely remained rudimentary for a considerable time. Yet, the seeds were sown. The rediscovery of texts, the power of the printing press, the courageous hands of anatomists like Vesalius, and the empirical observations of practical surgeons like Paré. These were the early, quiet revolutions that began to chip away at the monolithic structure of medieval medical thought. They opened the door to a future where direct observation, experimentation, and a relentless questioning of established wisdom would eventually transform the grim art of medieval medicine into the powerful science we recognize today. It is a testament to the enduring human spirit of inquiry, even against overwhelming odds and centuries of inherited dogma. Even as figures like Vesalius challenged ancient anatomical dogma and Paré championed more humane surgical practices, it is crucial to understand that these were mere sparks in a vast, lingering darkness. The transition from medieval to truly modern medicine was not a sudden leap, but an agonizingly slow, fitful crawl spanning centuries. The shocking truth about medieval medicine, particularly as it blended into the early modern period, is how profoundly entrenched its limitations remained, despite occasional flashes of genius. The shadows of ignorance, superstition, and flawed theory were long and persistent. Perhaps the single greatest obstacle to genuine medical progress was the continued, pervasive dominance of the humoral theory. Despite new anatomical insights, the fundamental belief that illness stemmed from an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile remained the bedrock of medical diagnosis and treatment. Physicians continued to prescribe bloodletting, purging, and dietary adjustments based on these principles, even when their observations of the body grew more accurate. The sheer weight of tradition, coupled with a lack of any viable alternative explanatory model for disease, meant that this ancient theory held sway well into the 18th and even 19th centuries in some areas. It was intellectually satisfying, offering a holistic explanation for everything from temperament to disease, and thus incredibly difficult to dislodge. Another monumental blind spot, which we have touched upon, was the complete absence of germ theory. The microscopic world of bacteria, viruses, and other pathogens remained entirely invisible and unknown. This meant that the true causes of infectious diseases, the greatest killers of the age, were utterly misunderstood. Even when cleanliness was practiced, it was for aesthetic or religious reasons, not because anyone grasped the connection between unseen microbes and illness. Surgeries, even by skilled hands, were performed without aseptic technique, leading to inevitable infection. Childbirth remained a fatal gamble, not due to lack of skill in delivery, but due to puerperal fever, silently transmitted by unwashed hands. Until the advent of the microscope in the 17th century, and the eventual work of figures like Pasteur and Lister in the 19th century, the medical world was fighting an invisible enemy with utterly inadequate weapons. The lack of effective anesthesia also remained a crippling limitation. As we explored, the soporific sponge and alcohol offered only unreliable, dangerous, or partial relief. This meant that any invasive procedure, from setting a complex fracture to an amputation, remained an experience of unimaginable agony. The patient's shock from pain alone was often fatal, even if the procedure itself was technically successful. Surgery, therefore, remained a last resort, performed with terrifying speed, and avoided at all costs. This fundamental barrier to pain relief profoundly limited the complexity and scope of what surgeons could even attempt. Furthermore, medical practice was still largely unstandardized and unregulated. While guilds attempted to impose some order and universities granted degrees, there was no universal licensing, no consistent curriculum, and vast disparities in skill and knowledge. Quackery continued to thrive on the margins, exploiting the desperation of the sick. A patient's experience could vary wildly depending on whether they encountered a truly skilled, for the time, barber surgeon, a compassionate monastic infirmerer, or an outright charlatan. This lack of consistent quality control meant that access to even rudimentary good care was a matter of sheer luck. The slow pace of technological innovation also played a significant role. While the printing press revolutionized knowledge dissemination, the development of specialized medical instruments lagged. The basic surgical toolkit remained largely unchanged for centuries. Microscopy, as a practical medical tool, would not fully emerge until the 17th century and beyond, and its implications for understanding disease would take even longer to grasp. Diagnostic tools beyond observation, pulse taking, and uroscopy simply did not exist. There were no stethoscopes, no thermometers, no X-rays, no blood tests. All the basic tools we take for granted today were far in the future. The influence of religion and superstition also continued to cast long shadows. While the intellectual elite might engage in more empirical inquiry, for the vast majority of the population, illness remained inextricably linked to divine will, sin, or malevolent magic. Prayer, pilgrimages, and folk remedies often took precedence over, or were blended with, formal medical advice. This meant that even when a physician had a potentially useful, albeit limited, intervention, patients might prefer a spiritual cure or simply lack the means to access professional help. The psychological and spiritual comfort offered by faith was, for many, the only genuine solace in the face of inevitable suffering and death. Finally, the sheer societal scale of disease itself often overwhelmed any nascent medical advancements. Even if a brilliant physician devised a new treatment, its impact was localized. Without public health infrastructure, without understanding of contagion, and without the means to mass produce or widely distribute remedies, epidemics like the plague or smallpox continued to devastate populations, rendering individual medical heroism almost insignificant in the face of widespread catastrophe. In conclusion, the period immediately following the true Middle Ages, while showing tantalizing glimpses of a new scientific spirit, remained deeply rooted in the limitations of its past. The transition was not a sudden awakening, but a prolonged twilight, where the ancient world's flawed brilliance slowly gave way to empirical questioning. The sheer persistence of humoral theory, the invisible enemy of germs, the agony of surgery without anesthesia, and the pervasive influence of superstition all combined to ensure that, for centuries after the medieval period ended, medicine remained a grim, uncertain art, often more likely to alleviate discomfort than to truly cure. It makes us appreciate not just the moments of breakthrough, but the long, hard, and often forgotten struggles that define humanity's ascent from profound medical ignorance. We have traversed the perplexing landscape of medieval medicine, glimpsing a world where healing was often a desperate gamble against the forces of nature, unseen spirits, and profound ignorance. We have seen the physician with his theoretical humors, the barber surgeon with his crude blade, the apothecary with his strange concoctions, and the sick patient, often left to the mercy of fate or the solace of prayer. We have witnessed the devastating impact of epidemics, the brutal realities of battlefield trauma, and the slow, arduous process of learning about the very body in which we reside. The journey has been, in many respects, a stark and sobering one. But as our narrative draws to a close, it is imperative to acknowledge the seismic shifts that eventually lifted medicine from these lingering shadows into the blinding light of scientific understanding. The breakthroughs of the Renaissance, which we touched upon, were but the first tentative steps. The true revolution, the one that makes the title of our discussion, "You'll Be Glad You Live Now," resound with profound gratitude, came much, much later. Consider the milestones that fundamentally reshaped our world. In the 17th century, the invention of the microscope by figures like Antony van Leeuwenhoek began to reveal the hidden world of microorganisms, tiny animalcules, that would later prove to be the culprits behind so many medieval scourges. Yet, it would take nearly 2 more centuries for the medical community to truly grasp the implications of this discovery. The 19th century was the crucible of transformation. The work of Louis Pasteur in proving germ theory irrevocably changed our understanding of disease causation. No longer were illnesses mysterious imbalances or divine punishments. They were caused by specific, identifiable microorganisms. This knowledge directly led to the groundbreaking work of Joseph Lister, who pioneered antiseptic surgery, dramatically reducing the horrific mortality rates from post-operative infection. Imagine, for centuries, surgeons were unaware that their unwashed hands and instruments were literally sowing death. Lister's simple yet revolutionary idea of cleanliness transformed the operating room from a place of dread to a place of hope. Simultaneously, the development of effective anesthesia finally liberated surgery from its agonizing constraint. The introduction of ether, chloroform, and later other anesthetics meant that patients could undergo complex, life-saving procedures without the terror of conscious pain. This innovation not only alleviated immense suffering, but also allowed surgeons the time and precision necessary to perform ever more intricate operations. The 20th century brought forth even more astonishing leaps. The discovery of antibiotics, beginning with Alexander Fleming's serendipitous observation of penicillin in 1928, provided medicine with its first true magic bullet against bacterial infections. Conditions that were once death sentences, pneumonia, sepsis, even a simple cut, became treatable. Vaccines, building on the earlier work of Edward Jenner with smallpox, eradicated or brought under control diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia, turning childhood from a gauntlet of potentially fatal illnesses into a relatively safe passage. And today, we stand on the shoulders of giants, wielding diagnostic tools that would be utterly inconceivable to a medieval physician. MRI machines, CT scanners, ultrasound, sophisticated blood tests, genetic sequencing. These allow us to peer inside the human body with unparalleled precision, identifying diseases at their earliest stages. We have targeted therapies, complex surgical interventions, organ transplantation, and a nuanced understanding of nutrition, public health, and mental well-being that would seem nothing short of miraculous to our ancestors. So, what are the enduring lessons from this long, often painful medical past? Firstly, it is a testament to human resilience. Our ancestors endured pain, disease, and hardship with a stoicism that defies modern comprehension. Their very survival, often against overwhelming odds, speaks to the incredible adaptive capacity of the human body and spirit. Secondly, it underscores the power of scientific inquiry and empirical observation. The slow, incremental triumph over ignorance was driven by individuals who dared to question established dogma, to look with fresh eyes, and to test hypotheses through observation and, eventually, experimentation. It reminds us that progress is not automatic. It requires relentless curiosity, intellectual courage, and a willingness to discard cherished but flawed beliefs. Finally, and most poignantly, it cultivates an immense sense of gratitude. The comforts and certainties of modern medicine are not accidental. They are the hard-won legacy of millennia of struggle, countless experiments, unsung discoveries, and the quiet heroism of those who suffered and those who sought to alleviate that suffering. The sterile operating room, the targeted antibiotic, the gentle hand of an anesthetist. These are not merely conveniences. They are the culminating miracles of a long and arduous journey from the terrifying, unpredictable world of medieval medicine. So, as you drift off into the quiet contemplation of history tonight, perhaps a soft smile touches your lips. For while the past is a fascinating realm to explore when it comes to health, there is no doubt you truly are glad you live now.